Wyoming Territory, late July of 1879, the fire had already taken half the town before anyone thought to wake her. Smoke clawed down the hallway of the boarding house, dragging heat and ash in its path. Sienna Fletcher stumbled from her room barefoot and coughing, her nightdress clinging to her legs. She barely had time to snatch her father's journal from the nightstand before the rafters groaned, and the roof above the kitchen collapsed in a roar of sparks. By the time she made it outside, the whole south side of Larkspur was glowing red against the night sky. She stood across the dirt road, her arms wrapped tight around her chest, and watched her home burn. Not just the room she rented, but the dress shop she had worked in since she was 16. Gone. The landlady's voice screaming about back rent still rang in her ears. Sienna had nowhere to go, no family left, not since the fever took her father last spring out by Rawlins, and no one stayed for a woman with nothing. By sunrise, the town had moved on. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice behind her, deep and low. "Are you all right?" She turned, blinking up at a tall man in a dusty trail coat, hat in hand. He looked about 30, maybe a year or two older. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing sun-browned forearms. There was dirt on his boots and a quiet steadiness in his gray eyes. Her throat caught. "I do not have anywhere to go." His gaze didn't shift, didn't scan her like he was measuring what she was worth. He just nodded. "My name's Jesse Lorne. I got a small place west of town, not much, but there's a spare room in the bunkhouse." "You can stay as long as you need." She frowned, taking a step back. "Why would you help me?" "Because I saw you come out of that fire barefoot, carrying nothing but a book," he said plainly. "And I figure anyone who runs for words when the world's burning still has something worth saving." Sienna hesitated, eyes falling to the worn leather journal in her hands. "It was my father's, I figured." He stepped back, giving her space. "I have a horse. You can ride with me, or I can walk beside you if that feels safer." She studied him, his calm manner, his kindness not forced or polished. After a long moment, she nodded. "All right." They rode out just after dawn, the scorched smell of town fading behind them. Jesse's horse was a steady roan, and he let her ride up front while he walked beside, leading the way down the dusty trail. He did not ask questions. He did not fill the silence. By the time they reached his land, the sun was high and the heat settled in the air like a blanket. His ranch sat low in a wide stretch of prairie, backed by hills and bordered with cottonwoods. A windmill turned slow in the breeze beside the barn. "You live here alone?" she asked as he helped her down. "For now. My folks passed on a few years ago." "I keep some cattle, a few horses." He looked over at her. "You hungry?" She hadn't realized how badly until he asked. She nodded. He brought out a plate of biscuits, smoked ham and half a peach from the icebox. They sat on the porch, eating quietly. Sienna kept glancing toward the hills behind the house. "You do not talk much," she said finally. "I talk when there's something worth saying." "And you thought asking a stranger to live with you was worth saying?" "I did not invite you to live with me," Jesse said, still chewing. "I offered you somewhere safe to land." She looked down at her plate, then at the wide fields beyond the porch. "It is quiet here," he nodded. "That is the thing about land. It does not ask anything from you but care." She blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. "I have not had quiet since my father died." Jesse set his plate aside. "You can stay until you find your feet. No one will bother you here." That night, she lay on a cot in the bunkhouse, the roof above her hole and the air cool through the slatted window. She held her father's journal tight, not reading it, just holding it. And when sleep came, it came without the smell of smoke. 3 days passed. Sienna helped where she could, sweeping, hanging wet clothes from the line, feeding the chickens. Jesse never told her what to do, but he never turned her away either. He kept working the land like he always had, breaking a new horse in the corral, checking fences, mending gear. She watched him from the porch sometimes, the way he moved with steadiness and purpose, like nothing could shake him. One afternoon, while she was washing linens out by the pump, he walked over with a tin cup in hand. "You ever seen a sunset from Hawk Ridge?" he asked. She shook her head. "Would you like to?" She hesitated. "Why?" He gave a small shrug. "I figure you have seen enough endings lately. Maybe it is time you saw one worth watching." That evening, they rode out just before the light started to change. The horses climbed the ridge slow, and when they reached the top, the whole valley spread out beneath them. The sky turned gold, then orange, then a deep, quiet purple as the sun dipped behind the hills. Sienna's breath caught. "I never thought I would see this kind of peace again," she whispered. Jesse looked over at her. "You deserve it." She turned to him, really seeing him now. The way the light touched the edge of his jaw, the soft crease at the corner of his mouth. He looked at her not like someone broken, but like someone whole. "I lost everything," she said quietly. "You did not lose yourself." She pressed her lips together, her eyes burning. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because I want to be." His voice was low, steady, "and because I like having you here." The wind moved soft through the grass. She reached out, her hand brushing his. He did not pull away, she did not either. And for the first time in a long time, Sienna Fletcher did not feel like something lost. She felt found. The morning after Hawk Ridge, Sienna rose before the rooster called. A pale hush still hung over the land, the kind that made each sound feel loud. The scrape of her boots on wood, the creak of the bunkhouse door, the soft splash of water in the basin as she washed her face. She tied her hair back and crossed the yard toward the barn, drawn by the clatter of hooves. Jesse was inside, brushing down the chestnut mare she hadn't seen him ride yet. He glanced up as she stepped into the doorway. "You're up early," he said, brushing in long, steady strokes. "I wanted to help with the morning feed." "You don't have to, I know." He didn't argue after that. He handed her a burlap sack of oats, and together they moved through the stalls in companionable quiet. The horses greeted her with soft huffs and flicking ears. She hadn't grown up around livestock, but she moved careful and learned quick. Jesse watched her once, then turned back to his own work, trusting her hands. Afterward, he poured water into a dented tin basin and splashed his neck. She leaned against the stable wall, wiping her palms on her skirt. "You always keep to this routine?" she asked. "Every day," he replied. "Cattle don't care if you're tired or grieving." She looked out at the pasture. "They remind me of my father's old watch, never stopped ticking even when he did." Jesse didn't speak right away. She appreciated that about him. He let things settle. "Was he a quiet man too?" he asked finally. "No," she said with a laugh that caught her off guard. "He talked to everyone, couldn't go 5 minutes without offering advice or a story, but he listened when it counted." They walked back toward the house together. Jesse pulled up a chair on the porch and sat, one boot resting over the other knee. She remained standing, arms folded loosely. "What are you thinking of doing?" he asked. She stared at the distant line of cottonwoods. "I don't know yet. I can't go back to Larkspur. There's nothing left there. There's a schoolhouse a few miles east. Teacher left when her husband took ill. They've been sending for a replacement, but no one's come." She turned to him. "How do you know?" "I helped build it," he said. "Years ago, just walls and a stove, but it's solid." "You read, you write, you could teach." Sienna hesitated. "I never taught before." Neither did she at first. She looked down at her hands. "It's a strange thought, starting something new." Jesse's voice was low. "Stranger things have happened." Later that afternoon, she found herself walking the ridge behind the barn, following an old fence line. The boards were weather-worn, some posts leaning. She paused beside one, running her hand across the splintered top. Behind her, Boots approached through the grass. "I saw you from the paddock," Jesse said. "Thought you might want company." "I needed air." He nodded, stepping up beside her. They stood without speaking, wind brushing through the tall grass around them. "I used to think I'd marry a merchant's son," she said after a while. "Someone who'd take over his father's books and talk about ledgers over supper." Jesse's brow ticked. "That sounds quiet." It sounded safe. She bent and picked up a smooth stone, turning it in her palm. "But safety doesn't always mean peace." He studied her face, the tilt of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "What changed?" he asked. "I did." The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of warm earth and dry hay. Jesse rested his hand lightly on the top rail of the fence. "You could stay," he said. "Not just until you find something, longer." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to build a life with someone who's already walked through fire and kept going. And because when you talk, I listen." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took his hand, fingers brushing across his knuckles like a promise made without ceremony. The sun began to slip lower, casting long golden lines through the grass. She turned to him, the last light catching in her hair. "I think I'd like that," she said. And he smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet certainty, like he'd known all along that peace didn't just come from land or cattle or quiet mornings, but from someone choosing to stay when they could have walked away. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of a grove of aspen trees, their white trunks catching the light like pale fire. It was a single-room structure with a tin roof and shuttered windows, the kind of place built by calloused hands and winter urgency. Jesse rode out with Sienna at sunrise, a wrapped bundle of bread and dried apples tied to his saddle horn. The ride was quiet, not from unease, but from a shared stillness that had settled between them like a worn blanket familiar, sure. Sienna swung down as they reached the small, fenced yard. She ran her fingers along the carved initials on the porch rail, then stepped through the crooked doorframe. Dust hung in the air, lit by the angled morning sun. The wood stove still held ash from some long-ago fire, and a broken slate leaned against the far wall. "There's a ledger inside that desk," Jesse said from the doorway. "Last teacher kept notes, lessons, names." Sienna opened the drawer. The ledger's ink had faded in places, the handwriting firm but hurried. She traced a line with her fingertip. "These are children's names." 13 of them? Her voice was soft. "They're still around. Some ride in from 2-3 miles off." She turned to face him. "They'll need books, chalk, a new stove by the look of it. I'll take care of the stove. As for the rest, there's a man in Casper who deals in school supplies. I'll ride for them next week." She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the room. "I don't know if I'll be good at this." "You'll find your way," he said. "Same as you found mine." That night she sat at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled above her elbows, ink on her knuckles. Jesse had brought in a stack of old readers from the trunk in the loft, his mother's, he'd said, from when she taught on the plains before marrying his father. Sienna sorted through them, setting aside torn pages, smoothing the spines of the salvageable ones. Jesse sat across from her, whittling a length of pine into what looked like a letter opener. The fire crackled low, filling the corners with warmth. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked without looking up. "Once, after my mother died. Thought maybe I'd sell the land, take what I could to St. Louis." He set the knife down. "But the thought of leaving this place, these hills, the way the air smells after rain, I couldn't do it." She glanced up. "You chose to stay." "I did." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the windows. Sienna closed the last book and folded her hands. "I've never had a place that felt like it was mine to choose." He reached across the table and rested his hand lightly over hers. "You do now." The next few days passed in steady rhythm. Jesse repaired the stove with parts from an abandoned line shack, hauling them in his wagon and fitting each piece with quiet precision. Sienna swept out years of dust, lined the windows with burlap to keep the glare off the children's slates, and stitched new cushion covers from feed sacks she found in the barn's loft. She met the families one by one. Jesse rode with her the first time, introducing her to folks settled along the valley's edge, ranchers, homesteaders, a widow with 3 boys and a mule named Edgar who followed her like a dog. Each child she met studied her with quiet eyes, some wary, some curious. None asked where she came from. They only asked when school would start. She told them September. One evening, as the last of summer began to slip from the air, they walked the edge of the pasture where the cattle had bedded down. Jesse carried a lantern, the light swinging low between them. The grass was cool beneath their boots, and the sky above stretched wide and black. "Today," she said, "a girl named Clara gave me a pressed flower, said it was for luck." Jesse looked over at her. "You keep it?" "I pinned it inside the ledger." They stopped near the far fence line, and Jesse rested the lantern on a post. The shadows of the hills behind them deepened into violet. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" she asked. "That you'd taken that trip east," he shook his head. "If I had, I'd have missed you." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the simple truth of it. She turned toward him, and in the soft light, she saw him not just as the man who'd helped her, but the one who'd waited without knowing for someone who would need him the way she had. She stepped closer. "I'm not afraid anymore." "I know." He touched her face then, calloused thumb brushing her cheekbone like he was learning its shape. She leaned forward, and when their lips met, it wasn't sudden or uncertain. It was the slow answer to a question neither had spoken aloud. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. "I want to stay," she said. He didn't answer with words. He only wrapped his arms around her and held her there, quiet and sure. As the wind swept across the land, they would build their life on one morning, one task, one shared breath at a time. By the third week of September, the valley had turned gold at the edges. Aspen leaves curled inward, and mornings came with a bite that caught behind the teeth. The children arrived on foot and horseback, cheeks flushed, hair tangled from wind. They filled the schoolhouse with the rustle of wool and the scrape of slate pencils, their voices shy at first, then louder, brighter. Sienna stood at the front of the room with her sleeves buttoned to the wrist, and her father's ledger now filled with handwriting of her own. Each morning she lit the stove, chalked the day's lessons, and opened the door to 13 expectant faces. She taught them not just letters and sums, but how to sit with silence and listen for the turning of thought. Some days they lingered after the bell, asking questions about rivers they'd never seen, cities they'd never heard of. That Friday, after the last child had gone, Jesse rode up on the bay gelding with a parcel wrapped in brown cloth tied behind his saddle. He waited at the steps while she swept chalk dust from the porch. "You're wanted in the north pasture," he said, offering a hand. Sienna eyed him. "Wanted by who?" "By whoever left this note." He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper with a single word. "Come." She narrowed her eyes. "Did you write this?" "Not unless my handwriting's changed without telling me." She gave him a long look, then took his hand. They rode together through the amber light, past the last stretch of hayfield and into the tall grass beyond the creek. The horses picked their way slowly, hooves muffled against the soft earth. When they crested the last rise, Sienna saw what he'd meant. There in the clearing stood a frame of rough pine posts, not yet roofed but square and solid. A pair of windows waited to be fitted, and the stone foundation had been set with care. "I found the blueprints in the loft," Jesse said. "My father drew them for a second cabin back when he thought my brother might come back. He never did." Sienna slid down from the saddle, heart tightening. "This is your land." It still is. She stepped toward the unfinished frame, fingers brushing one of the upright beams. "You're building something?" "I am. For you, for us," he said simply. The wind stirred her skirts, lifted a curl from her braid. "I never asked," she began. "I know, you didn't have to." She turned to him, eyes wide. "You'd have done this even if I'd said no," he nodded. "Because I'd still want you to have a place, even if it wasn't with me." Sienna crossed the distance between them and laid her palm against his chest, over the steady rhythm she'd come to know like her own breath. "I do want it with you." His expression softened, not into surprise but into quiet certainty. He reached behind the saddle and untied the parcel, handing it to her. Inside was a folded length of calico with tiny sprigs of wild rose printed across the fabric. She looked up at him, startled. "For curtains," he said, "or whatever you'd like." She held the cloth close, throat thick with words she hadn't prepared. "I never thought I'd be wanted this way." "You were never unwanted," he said, "only waiting." They stood there as the light slipped lower, the unfinished cabin casting long shadows across the grass. Sienna leaned into him, her forehead resting against the curve of his shoulder. He didn't move, just let her stay there, wrapped in the quiet. Later, as dusk settled fully, they rode home without speaking. The stars came out one by one, and the lantern in the kitchen window glowed steady in the dark. Inside, she laid the fabric on the table, smoothing it flat. Jesse poured hot water from the kettle into 2 mugs, the scent of dried mint rising with the steam. He handed her one and sat across from her. "Do you want to name the cabin?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why?" "Because it'll be ours. And things that belong to us deserve names." She considered that a long time, then said, "Call it Stillwater." He nodded. "That fits." Outside, the wind rustled the dry leaves. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and the space between them felt full, not of silence, but of something warm and lasting. They didn't speak again that night, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every answer had already been given. The first frost came overnight, silvering the tall grass and stiffening the clothesline into a pale ribbon above the yard. Sienna wrapped a shawl around her shoulders as she stepped outside, the chill catching at her breath. Inside the schoolhouse, the stove already crackled, and the room filled quickly with the heat of wool coats and the chatter of children pulling slates from satchels. By October's end, Stillwater Cabin had walls, a roof, and a door that Jesse hung on leather hinges he'd cut himself. Sienna stepped through that door for the first time on a morning when the sky was the color of smoke and the chimney coughed to life for the first time. The calico she'd chosen for the curtains hung soft in the windows. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, where Jesse had carved a shallow groove with the tip of his knife. "It's for seeds," he said from behind her, setting down a small tin box. "In spring, my mother used to keep mustard seeds there to dry." She turned toward him. "You remember things like that." "I try to." Her hand brushed his as she stepped past. "Then let's plant something when the thaw comes. You planning on staying that long?" "I'm planning on staying longer." That night, she moved her few belongings into the cabin. Jesse hadn't said the word home, but the way he stood back and let her open each drawer, touch each shelf that told more than any vow could, in the weeks that followed, her days folded into a rhythm she hadn't known to want. Teaching by day, evenings spent helping Jesse with the winter feed, and nights passing quietly beside the fire they built together, each flame a small promise kept. One evening, as wind swept the valley and the oil lamp flickered in the corner, Jesse came in from the barn with his coat dusted in snow. He pulled off his gloves, eyes catching hers across the room. "I've been thinking," he said, brushing his hands dry on a towel. "About what?" He stepped closer. "About what a woman might want besides a roof and a warm stove." She set down the mending in her lap. "You think I need more? I think you deserve to be asked." She studied him, the way he stood with his hands loose at his sides, not braced for rejection, not rehearsing promises, just waiting steady. "I don't need much," she said, "but I want to belong somewhere. To someone who sees me, not just what I can do." "I see you. I know." He crouched beside her, hand resting gently on her knee. "Then marry me, Sienna." Her answer came without pause. Yes. They married on a Sunday morning beneath the cottonwoods that lined the creek, the leaves gone to rust and gold. Clara, the girl who'd once given her a pressed flower, handed Sienna a bundle of sage and late-blooming asters. Jesse wore a clean shirt and a jacket his father had stitched decades earlier, the seams careful and strong. The preacher from Casper rode in, shaking dust from his boots and smiling through the ceremony. There were no grand words, only simple ones, and when Jesse placed the plain gold ring on Sienna's finger, her hands didn't tremble. Afterward, the neighbors gathered beneath the open sky for coffee boiled thick and a pie made from the last of the summer apples. Children played near the creek, their laughter carrying across the water. Sienna stood beside Jesse, her fingers laced with his, and for the first time in her life she wasn't waiting for something to fall away. That winter was hard. The snow came early and stayed late. But they had wood stacked high, and Jesse's cattle fared well. Sienna taught by lantern light when the days shortened, and Jesse split logs with a rhythm she came to recognize from inside the cabin walls. They made a bed from pine, covered it with quilts stitched by her mother long before larkspur ever burned. Some nights, when the wind howled, they lay close beneath those quilts, talking in low voices about future summers, fruit trees, maybe a boy who'd carry Jesse as quiet or a girl sharp-eyed like Sienna. By spring, the cabin had a garden out back, and the groove in the windowsill held mustard seeds drying in the sun. One evening, Sienna stood at the edge of the porch as Jesse came in from the field, dust on his trousers and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. She watched him tie off his bridle and walk toward her, the same steady stride she'd first followed down that road outside Larkspur. "You tired?" she asked, smiling. "No," he said, pulling her close. "I've never been more awake." She pressed her hand to his chest, felt the warmth there, the life they'd built from ash and earth one day at a time. And as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods and the air filled with the sound of birds returning to the hills, Sienna tilted her face up to his and kissed him slow, certain. They stayed there a long time, wrapped in a silence that needed no mending, together. Home. And full of more tomorrows than either of them had ever dared to speak aloud.